Welcome to Not Your Typical Church Ladies, faith conversations for your real life. I'm Vicky, and each week I am joined with my fellow workers in the vineyard, Anne and Karen, to break open the Sunday scriptures and talk about life and faith and everything in between. Join your not typical church ladies on this journey each week.
Welcome back, everybody. It is Anne, Vicky, and me, Karen, for our first Sunday of Advent conversation. And this year we thought we would shake it up a little bit. And instead of specifically talking about each reading, the first, second, and third reading, we're kind of going to do an overview theme of one of the characters. And so this week we are going to be focusing on John the Baptist. And while I was looking at the readings, I'm like, he's my total spirit animal because I am all about the wilderness. I cut my hair once a year, and it was just, I don't know if I could really eat locusts though, but he's just like a super cool guy, and I'm really excited to hear what Anne and Vicky have to say about John the Baptist and making the way for the Messiah to come. And hey, ladies.
Hey.
Hey.
Yeah, this year Advent is kind of weird because the fourth Sunday of Advent is actually Christmas Eve. So it's only going to seem like Advent is 3 weeks long. And John the Baptist is actually, we get him in, I think, like 2 or 3 of the weekly readings this year. So we decided to kind of take the broader picture of the Advent story and the Christmas story and look at how each of these figures that we see in scripture welcomes Emmanuel. And John the Baptist is the very first one to do it. Even from before he was born, he was welcoming Emmanuel. So I'm excited for the conversation too.
Absolutely. And Karen, I'm very excited that he's your spirit animal because he's the direct opposite of my spirit animal. Yeah, nope.
No
none
camping
to all
for
those
Vicky.
Yeah, no camping for me. And I just always think when we read some of those things, his poor mom. Like imagine being his mom.
I never thought about that.
That's really funny because I didn't either.
Like when he was a kid, because he was such like a radical figure, right? Like he was not in the mainstream. He was off in the wilderness wearing like animal skins and eating bugs and being a prophet. But like what? How did he get there?
All I could imagine is Elizabeth being like, put that down. Don't eat that bug. Don't do that. Don't roll around in the mud.
Well, who's that kid?
I think Elizabeth should be like the saint for every mom who's struggling with a child. Because could you imagine being like, why can't you just be like your cousin Jesus?
Right. And she was older, right? So she was older. Can you imagine her trying to keep up with this kid?
Yeah, I know. My parents say that too. They're like, I can't keep up with your kids now. Like, I can't imagine having kids at this age. And I'm like, I can't imagine you having kids at your age either. But I mean, also think about the kind of like struggle that John would have had because he knew his mission was to pave the way for Jesus, but then he had like all this attention with it, and then he kind of just got moved aside, and then Jesus came in. But what I love about it, and I'm jumping to Jesus's baptism, and I know that's not the scripture passage, but what I like about their relationship is that it's not this like egotistical, I'm superior than you, because Jesus says in the scripture, John is the greatest of all.
Right.
But John baptizes Jesus. Like John was waiting to be baptized by Jesus, and then he flips it. And so there's this like mutual respect and love and nurturing between the cousins that sometimes in our lives we don't have with our own family. There's always that like one up, or I could do that better, or wish they didn't do that type of thing. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, just coming out of Vicky's comments about Elizabeth and just got me thinking.
Yeah, I mean, they're so generous and humble with each other. in a way that it's so different from the way I think a lot of like people in power or leaders tend to be,
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
I also think too, what struck me when you were talking about that is it's such a model of how we're called to minister. And I mean, like everyone, right? Not just people who work in the church, but the idea of like our job, right, is evangelist in just our lives is to get out of the way for Jesus at some point, to pave the way and then let Jesus do the rest. And that's exactly what John does. And he's so humble about it that, he does. He kind of just like goes into the background. We know at one point he was in jail. Then we hear, about his end, but he has this moment. And then when Jesus is fully ready to step into his ministry, he just kind of fades away and redirects people to Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, they talk about him being, the one who he prepared the way, but he pointed the way to Jesus too. Like he was completely transparent. Like you could just look through him and see Jesus. Like he wasn't taking any of the attention or the glory for himself. He was there to show us who Jesus was. And that was his purpose. And he went at it like at 11, it seems, right? Just like all the time.
Yeah.
I think too, he's such an interesting figure because, they talk about him as being like the voice crying out in the wilderness, which is a reference back to Isaiah, but like it's not just the wilderness because that's where he went to hang out and pray and fast and all that stuff. It's the wilderness because he was ministering in an in-between time. Like he's sort of, some scholars will call him like a hinge figure between the Old Testament and the New Testament because he took the prophecies and he was like, yeah, it's about this guy. This is, this is where everything changes. And so to think about him as being like just a figure, a role model for us in all the in-between places where we are, because honestly, in these first few weeks of Advent, the readings don't put us in the Christmas vibe yet. We're in like the end of the world vibe still, like the readings here, the first few Sundays at Mass and Advent are really, they're about the end times and what comes next. And like, and I mean, not to get like totally like end of the world about it, but just in our own lives, what are the endings and what is the new thing that God is trying to do?
Yeah.
That's where I think John the Baptist can speak to us today too.
I like what you said about he was able to point like from the Old Testament to like the prophecies and everything. It's like he connected the dots for everybody to be like have their own aha moment. And so like what has been maybe a time in your lives with family or friends that you've been kind of like John the Baptist and made a connection for somebody and they're like, oh, okay, I get it. Because a lot of the times we're like, okay, yeah, that was cool what happened in scripture a really long time ago. But the point that I think we are trying to make in this podcast and having this conversation is taking what we've heard and putting it into our everyday lives. So I know I'm totally putting you guys on the spot, but has there been an instance in like family that you have been that pointer person or, you connected the dots for somebody or was able to kind of be John-like for somebody else to come through?
So I keep joking because one of my top strength is connectiveness. I love building connections and figuring out how people are connected. And it's something that drives my husband crazy sometimes because I'm like, no, and he did this and and this is how they're all related. And it makes him go crazy. But other times he really appreciates it because I can help him see those connections between people that we engage with and how, like these two people should meet because they would, they have this in common or talk about this to this person. And it's one of my favorite things. I don't know. I just love seeing how people are connected. And I think, I've seen it a lot, just in talking, trying to help people see where God has been in situations. I think, especially, talk about the end times, but everyone goes through those dark periods in life and trying to really see how this person was light for you during that. has been something that I try to always bring out when I can for people, because I think that hope in hard situations is so important.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
I was actually thinking about youth ministry, John the Baptist as a role model for youth ministers, because I feel like, well, actually, this could be anybody, not just teens. It's just that that's my lens. But sometimes we talk about like pre-evangelization. Like sometimes I say the most important thing I do as a youth minister is to get to know the teens' names and call them by name when they walk in the door. Like it's such a simple thing, but before you even teach anybody anything or try to get them involved in anything you're doing, you just have to see them. You have to like, just without words, even like embody God's love for them. It's helping them feel noticed. We say noticed, named, and known is what we're trying to do. And I think that John the Baptist is great for that, because it's almost like we're getting ready to get ready,
Yeah.
And to think about Advent too as like a preparation process. Like I was talking with somebody around the office recently about like, the future and what are we doing? And it's like, we're not even sowing seeds yet. We're like at the point where we're like purchasing the field, right? Or we're like preparing the soil even. So it's just that idea that like, what does it mean to prepare the way? It might be a lot simpler than you think, right? It might be just that personal connection that just makes God's love real for somebody.
I love that I get to minister with you too. Like, I think it's just great. And I think it's sometimes like, I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's so cool that we have the three of us in ministry and sharing that mission. And like John also shared in the mission and he helped others share in the mission. And I love the fact that we can have conversations like this and get a glimpse of each one of us personally and share like how can others do that for people who are watching. How can they do that for others? And like, isn't that the point? It's coming to church, it's getting filled with the Spirit and moving toward that evangelization and preparing the way for other people without judgment or egos or anything like that. So thanks, ladies. Do we have any last minute comments or things that we wanted to share before we head into next week?
Well, I was thinking about, I know we weren't going to look too specifically at the scripture readings, but I can't. And like Isaiah is in the first reading several times in the first few weeks of Advent too. And we weren't going to really talk about that, but I think the John the Baptist stuff is a good place to kind of fit some of that in. Yeah. As I was just looking at kind of all the readings for the first few weeks of Advent this year, the sense of like waiting, I noticed in both the Isaiah readings and in the second readings, which come from Corinthians and Peter, I think, there's this sense of like anticipation or expectation that like God is going to do great things, but we're still waiting for it, right? And even John the Baptist is like, the Messiah is coming and it's him and he's going to do great things. But like in that moment, nobody knew who Jesus was really, right? Like, so it wasn't maybe apparent. And so like, what does it mean, first of all, to be prophetic in a time of change, but also to wait for the fulfillment to come in God's time, right? Because we have the image about God being the potter and we're the clay. And so we're being fashioned into something. And whenever we're being fashioned into something new, it's uncomfortable because, I mean, what it's like we've seen those potters mold the clay and how much they squish it and how much like things get, like just worked over and turned around and like pushed together and pulled apart. And like, we're in it right now. I mean, I don't know how much we want to talk about the specifics of our job, but I think most people listening or watching to this podcast are probably aware that all three of us have new job descriptions this year.
Yeah.
And that we're all three of us now officially employed by both of the two parishes that we have in our cluster. And so we're kind of on the front lines right now. Like, well, what does it mean to have these two identities as parishes, but also to have a shared identity? And what does this look like? And all the little decisions we're making to take care of our people and to communicate things. And it's, we're in a place where like old things are changing, new things are happening, and we're in the middle of a transition. And I have a sense that like great things are to come, right? But we also know that there's a process to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After you said all that, it got me thinking of something that you said earlier about what like things dying and reforming and coming anew. And it's almost as though like there is this process of like, what do we need to not necessarily die, but what do we need to let go of to be able to grow healthier and grow in a different direction? And the biggest word I keep thinking of is just patience. I mean, we God has the plan, but as humans, we are so impatient. Like especially now in our society, it's like instant gratification. And we probably touched base on this the last podcasts that we've talked to because the themes are similar every year, regardless if it's A, B, or C. But isn't it funny how we still are talking about patience and transition and transformation and all these seeds that were planted and just waiting for that to come to fruition. So yeah, we're still, that's what it is to have faith, right? Is to patiently wait for something bigger than we can even expect.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think, John is such a great example of that because as much as we through the scriptures, a lot of times we hear about John's great following and how John kept being like, it's not me, even though it's not me, it's him. But for as many people as probably followed John, there were probably a lot of people who thought he was a crazy guy who was eating bugs and wearing like, why are you going out in the desert? And rejected him and rejected, this, what he was saying. And we see that, going back to Lent, going back to Easter, like we all know about what happens with Jesus. So the idea of there had to be periods for John where it was lonely or he questioned his calling or he questioned why he was called to do this special role. But he had the faith and he trusted in what he was receiving from God and what he could see in the scriptures and knowing what was to come and the great thing that was coming to keep going even when it was probably harder. And, again, like I go back to his mom was probably like, why can't you just be normal and go get a real job or, things that moms do, that idea that he had to really plant firmly in his faith to know that what he was doing was right and knowing that he had that role to play. And then also being humble enough to then step away when it was time to.
Yeah.
Ooh, lots to think about.
Yeah.
Do we want to leave? Is there a question that we would like our listeners or viewers to kind of ponder for this week? Anything that we said that, we kind of want to make a point of maybe, I don't know, what do we need to let go to fully be able to receive Jesus or anything that you guys can think of, maybe a little tidbit?
Well, maybe, just thinking about the voice crying out in the wilderness, right? To make clear the path. What's, how do you point the way to others and be, a window, not a wall, to God in the wilderness places, in the in-between moments, that make up most of our lives. Yeah. And I think too, that just the idea of like Advent being like an already and a not yet kind of place. So we know the Messiah is coming. We know Jesus is coming. We know God is working great things, but we're not there yet. So one of the quotes I pulled up from Corinthians in week 1 of Advent said, you're not lacking any spiritual gift as you wait. So, maybe a good question would be like, well, what are the spiritual gifts you have right now while you're waiting in this, in the wilderness, being the voice? What are the things that God's sustaining you with, as we're in the work and the waiting?
All right. I guess we're going to leave it at that.
Yeah.
Great conversation, ladies. Thank you so much. And tune in next week when we talk about the woman who did it all, Mary. So join us next week. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
On behalf of Anne, Karen, and myself, thank you again for listening to this episode of Faith Conversations for Your Real Life. Please make sure to subscribe to wherever you're listening or watching this episode. You can find the readings linked in the description box below, and we can't wait to see you again next time on Faith Conversations for Your Real Life with your favorite not so typical church ladies.